Before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone listening around the world. It still amazes me how far this show has reached. So a few shout outs this week to Ryan listening in Leeds, Sophie in London, Callum tuning in from Glasgow, Jade in Manchester, Ethan in Sydney and Priya listening in Toronto. I've also seen messages come through from Marcus in Cape Town, Alina in Madrid, Tom in Auckland and Aidan listening in Dublin, which is incredible. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, let me know. I genuinely love seeing how global this community is becoming. You can find me on all the socials, just look for What They Hide Pod, and there's an email address that you can find in the show notes. And if you're enjoying the show, please don't forget to follow, leave a review, and please share the episode. It really helps more people find the podcast. Now, this week's episode is the first part of a 3-part series. A story that spans decades. A story that involves power, trust and silence. And one that would eventually become one of the most disturbing cases in British history. This episode contains discussions of abuse, exploitation and institutional failure. Some themes may be distressing for listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Alright, let's crack on with the show. Leeds, Northern England. Late at night. The streets are mostly empty, shops closed, lights dimmed behind curtains, and somewhere in the distance, music. A dance hall or a club, the kind of place where young people gather, where voices are louder, where laughter carries into the night. Inside, no one is thinking about danger, because the man standing near the door is familiar, recognisable. Even then, he's older than most of the people in the room, but not out of place. He moves easily, comfortably, watching. In Leeds, people knew his name, or at least they thought they did. He was local, a personality, someone who seemed to belong wherever he went. He talked easily, joked, helped organise events, the kind of man people trusted, the kind of man who could walk into almost any room and be welcomed. At first, there was nothing obvious, nothing you could point to and say, that's wrong. Just moments, small ones, a look that lingered a little too long, a hand that stayed where it shouldn't, a presence that felt uncomfortable, but not enough for anyone to say something out loud. Because in places like that, in moments like that, people doubt themselves. They second guess. They tell themselves they're imagining it. And so it stayed quiet, not silence, but something softer. Whispers, a comment here, a look exchanged there. Nothing written down, nothing reported, just a feeling that something wasn't quite right. But no one could explain exactly what. Over time, those small moments started to form something else. A reputation, not public, not spoken openly, but known, quietly, among certain people. The kind of knowledge that exists without ever being confirmed. The kind that sits just below the surface. Because the man at the centre of it all didn't look like a threat. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't avoiding attention. If anything, he seemed to seek it. He built a presence, a persona, something larger than himself. And the more familiar he became, the harder it was to question him. Because people trust what they recognise. They trust what they see often. They trust what feels normal. Even when something underneath it isn't. By the time those early whispers began, the foundation was already there. A man who could move through spaces without suspicion. A man who could gain access. A man who could be seen. And not truly seen at all. Looking back, people would later say they noticed things. Moments. Instincts. That feeling that something wasn't right. But at the time, those things stayed where they were. Unspoken, unchallenged, hidden, in plain sight. Because the story of Jimmy Savile doesn't begin with exposure, it doesn't begin with evidence, it begins here, in small moments, in overlooked details, in the spaces where something feels wrong, but no one says it out loud. And over time, these moments would grow into something far darker, something that would stretch across decades, across institutions, across an entire country. Because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone thinks they know. This is what they hide, hidden crimes in plain sight. And this is the story of how one man became untouchable. To understand how a man becomes untouchable, you have to start long before anyone is watching. Before the television, before the fame, before the access. You have to go back to where it began. Leeds, 1920s England. A city built on industry, smoke rising from factories, terraced houses packed tightly together, lives shaped by work, routine and survival. Jimmy Savile was born in 1926, one of several children in a working class family. His mother was deeply religious, strict, dominant, a woman who believed in control, in discipline, in moral authority. And in that household, those ideas mattered, because control, once learned early, has a way of staying. People who knew Savile later would describe him in ways that didn't quite align. Sometimes charming, sometimes strange, sometimes intensely private. He learned early how to shift between those states, to present what people expected, while keeping parts of himself hidden. And that ability would become one of the most important parts of who he was. During the Second World War, young men were sent to fight, but others were sent somewhere else. The coal mines, the Bevan boys, a lottery, random selection, young men assigned to work underground instead of going to war. Jimmy Savile was one of them. The environment was harsh, dark, physically demanding. A place where strength mattered, where hierarchy mattered, where survival depended on understanding how to navigate power. And in places like that, people learned quickly who to be, when to speak, when not to, and how to exist inside a system without drawing the wrong kind of attention. When the war ended, the country began to rebuild, but for Savile, something else was beginning. Opportunity. Dance halls became the centre of social life, young people gathering. Music, movement, freedom. And Savile found his place there. Not just as a participant, but as someone with control. He worked as a dance hall manager, a position that gave him something important: access to people, to environments, to situations where he could decide who came in and who didn't. Power doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A door you control, a space you manage, a presence people recognise. Savile understood that. He understood how to position himself, to be seen as useful, friendly, reliable. The kind of person others trust without questioning. And once that trust exists, it becomes difficult to challenge. Savile also entered the world of professional wrestling, a place built on performance, on image, on physical presence. Here he learned something else: how to create a character, how to control how people saw him, strength, confidence, dominance. Even if those things weren't always real, they could be made to look real, and that's what mattered. By this point, the pieces were already forming: control, access, performance, the ability to move between different versions of himself, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to appear ordinary. Because nothing attracts attention like obvious danger, but something that blends in, something familiar, something trusted, can move through the world unnoticed. Looking back, this is where it starts to become clear. Not a single moment, but in patterns, environments that rewarded control, roles that provided access, spaces where he could move freely, without question. And over time, those elements would combine into something far more dangerous. Because long before the fame, before the institutions, before the protection, the foundation was already there, built quietly, in plain sight. Next, the rise of a public figure, and how Jimmy Savile became someone no one thought to question. By the late 1950s, Britain was changing. Music was becoming louder, youth culture was beginning to take shape, and radio was becoming something powerful. A voice could travel across the country, into homes, into bedrooms, into the everyday lives of people who would never meet the person speaking. And for Jimmy Savile, that was an opportunity. Savile's early broadcasting work began with stations like Radio Luxembourg. At the time, it was one of the few places where popular music could reach a wide audience. It wasn't formal, it wasn't rigid, and that suited him. He didn't sound polished, he didn't follow the expected style, but that difference became his advantage. because people remembered him. And once people remember your voice, they begin to recognise it. And recognition is the first step towards trust. By the early 1960s, Savile moved into the BBC. At the time, the BBC represented something more than entertainment. It represented authority, credibility. To appear on the BBC was to be accepted, to be trusted. And that trust extended beyond the screen. Because if someone is welcomed into people's homes through television, they are rarely questioned outside of it. Savile's role in Top of the Pops placed him at the centre of something new, a programme watched across the country. Young audiences, music, cultural change, and Savile became part of that movement, not just presenting it, but existing within it, a face people saw regularly, a voice they recognised instantly, a figure who felt familiar. By now, the image was fully formed. Tracksuits, gold chains, a distinctive voice, something unusual but consistent. And consistency matters, because the more predictable someone appears, the less people question them. Savile controlled how he was seen, not by hiding, but by being visible, by creating a version of himself that people accepted, even if they didn't fully understand it. His influence didn't stop with broadcasting. Savile moved easily between different worlds, nightclubs, public events, charity work. He understood how to place himself at the centre of activity, where people gathered, where attention was focused, where his presence felt normal. And over time, that presence expanded. As his public profile grew, doors opened. Hospitals, charities, institutions built on trust. Places where people were vulnerable. Places where authority figures were rarely challenged. Savile was not treated as an outsider in these spaces. He was welcomed, given freedom to move, to visit, to return, and with that came something far more important than fame: access. He raised money, visited patients, spoke about helping others, and that image became central to how he was perceived. Because once someone is associated with good, it becomes difficult to imagine them doing harm. The two ideas don't sit comfortably together, so people choose the one that feels easier to accept. By this point, Savile had become something more than a presenter. He was a fixture, a known presence, someone who moved between media and institutions without resistance, and that familiarity created something subtle, not protection in an official sense, but something close to it. Because people don't question what feels normal, they don't challenge what appears trusted, and they don't look too closely at something that fits into the world around them. By the early 1970s, the position was established. A public figure, a trusted personality, a man who could move freely between environments without drawing suspicion. And from the outside, there was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. Because sometimes, the most important parts of a story are the ones no one is looking at. There are places built on trust, places where people don't expect harm, places where vulnerability is not unusual but protected, hospitals, spaces where people are at their most exposed, and where those who enter are assumed to be there for the right reasons. One of the places Jimmy Savile became closely associated with was Stoke Mandeville Hospital, a hospital known for specialist care, a place where patients stayed not just for days, but for weeks, months, sometimes longer. Savile didn't just visit occasionally. He became part of the environment, a familiar face, someone staff recognised, someone patients came to expect. At some point, Savile was given something very few outsiders ever receive: a key, access, the ability to enter parts of the hospital without needing permission each time, to move through corridors at different hours, to be present without question. And once someone has that kind of access, they are no longer treated as a visitor. They become part of the system. Savile was known to move freely within the hospital. Wards, rooms, corridors, day or night. There were no constant checks, no consistent supervision, because there didn't appear to be a reason for it. From the outside, he was helping, raising money, supporting the hospital, giving his time, and people who are seen as helpful are rarely restricted. Trust in places like this builds quickly. Staff are busy, patients rely on familiarity, and when someone becomes a constant presence, they stop standing out. Savile had positioned himself perfectly, not as an authority figure, not as medical staff, but as something else, a trusted outsider. Close enough to be accepted, far enough not to be questioned. His work with hospitals wasn't just local. It became part of his public image, fundraising, appearances, stories of generosity, and those stories travelled through television, through media, reinforcing the same idea again and again, that he was someone doing good. And once that image is established, it becomes difficult to see anything else. It wasn't just one hospital. Savile's presence extended into multiple institutions, different locations, different environments, but the pattern remained the same. Familiarity, freedom of movement, minimal oversight, and an assumption of trust. Because in environments built on care, questioning someone who appears helpful feels wrong, unnecessary, even inappropriate, and that creates something dangerous, not through intention, but through absence, an absence of scrutiny. From the outside, there was nothing unusual, a well-known figure spending time in hospitals, helping, supporting, being present. Everything appeared exactly as it should, and that's what made it work. Because by this point, everything was already in place. The reputation, the access, the trust, the ability to move between spaces without resistance. Nothing needed to be forced. Nothing needed to be hidden in the traditional sense, because the environment itself allowed it. The most unsettling part of this story is not what people saw, it's what they didn't question. Because everything about this looked normal, expected, even admirable, and that's how it remained. Not hidden in darkness, but existing quietly within places built on trust, in plain sight. By the time Jimmy Savile had become a national figure, the image was firmly established, familiar, trusted, a presence that moved easily between television, hospitals, and public life. But beneath that, there were moments, small ones, easy to dismiss. They weren't formal complaints, not written down, not reported through official channels, just comments, a remark made in passing, a look exchanged between colleagues, a feeling that something wasn't quite right, but nothing that could be clearly defined, and without something clear, there is nothing to act on. Inside the BBC, the culture at the time was structured, hierarchical. Decisions moved downward, questions rarely moved up, and people understood their place within that structure. Challenging someone with status was not easy, especially someone like Savile, recognisable, successful, someone associated with programmes watched by millions. To question him would not have felt straightforward. It would have felt risky, because reputation doesn't just protect someone publicly, it protects them privately. If a person is known for doing good, for raising money, for helping institutions, then any doubt feels out of place, unfair, even inappropriate, and that creates something powerful. Not silence enforced from above, but silence created from within. Over time, people would later say the same thing, that there were moments, situations that felt uncomfortable, interactions that didn't sit right. But at the time, those moments stayed where they were, unspoken, because uncertainty is easy to ignore, especially when it conflicts with what everyone else believes. And as the years passed, the environment around Savile expanded. Different institutions, different locations, the same pattern repeating. Familiarity, access, trust, and later, questions began to reach beyond the places he was most publicly associated with, including locations like Haute de la Garenne, a children's home where years later investigations would explore historical abuse allegations involving multiple individuals. Savile's name would appear in that wider context, not as a proven fact within that specific location, but as part of a broader pattern of concern. And that detail matters, because it shows something important. This was not confined to one building, not limited to one institution, but connected to a pattern that stretched further than people had understood at the time. Looking back, the question seems simple. Why didn't anyone stop him? But at the time, it didn't feel that simple, because no one person saw everything. No single moment was enough. And the man at the centre of it all didn't look like a threat. He looked like someone people already trusted. And when trust is already established, it becomes the hardest thing to question. So the whispers stayed where they were, between people, between moments, never fully forming into something that could be acted upon. And as time passed, that silence became part of the story. Not something imposed, but something allowed. By the time Jimmy Savile had become a household name, everything people could see made sense. A man on television, a voice on the radio, a presence in hospitals, a figure associated with charity. There was nothing unusual about any of it, nothing that stood out, and that's exactly why it worked. Savile moved between worlds, television studios, hospital wards, events, institutions built on trust, and in each of those places he appeared to belong, No resistance, no scrutiny, no reason to question him, because everything about him fit. There was something else about the way Savile moved through these spaces. He wasn't tied to one place. He travelled between hospitals, between institutions, between events, and he often did it in his own vehicle, a camper van. It gave him something most people inside those environments didn't have: independence, the ability to arrive and leave on his own terms, to exist between locations without being accountable to any one system. And more than that, it created a space that was his, separate, not part of the hospital, not part of the institution, but always nearby. And in a story defined by access, by movement, by the absence of oversight, that detail matters, because it meant there were moments that existed just outside the view of everyone else. But patterns don't always reveal themselves immediately. Not when they're small, not when they happen in different places, not when no one is comparing notes, because one moment on its own doesn't mean anything. A second, still unclear. A third, easy to dismiss, and so the pattern remains hidden. Not because it's invisible, but because no one is looking at it all at once. This is where something important happens. Something that doesn't feel dramatic at the time. The illusion of normality becomes fixed. Savile wasn't questioned because there was no clear reason to question him. He wasn't restricted because he hadn't been seen as a threat. He wasn't challenged because no single moment demanded it. And that absence of challenge allowed everything else to continue. One of the reasons this went unnoticed was distance. Not physical distance, but separation. Different people, different places, different times. No shared understanding, no full picture, just fragments. And fragments are easy to ignore. Later, people would describe something difficult to define. A feeling that something wasn't right. But at the time, that feeling had nowhere to go, because it didn't have a name, it didn't have proof, it didn't have a voice. By now, Savile didn't need to protect himself. The system around him did it for him. Not intentionally, but naturally, through trust, through familiarity, through reputation. Because once someone reaches that position, they don't need to hide. They exist within structures that make questioning them unlikely. And this is the point where the story changes. Not publicly, not yet, but quietly. Because everything that would later be exposed was already happening, already in motion, already repeating, hidden, not by secrecy, but by the fact that no one was connecting it together. For years, people saw Jimmy Savile. They heard him. They welcomed him. They trusted him. And all the while, something else was happening. in the same rooms, on the same days, behind the same doors. But no one was looking at it as a whole. No one was saying it out loud, and no one was stopping it. Not yet. Because in part 2, we step away from what people saw and into what was really happening. The pattern, the silence, and the voices that for decades were never heard. And once you hear them, you don't forget them. This is what they hide. Hidden crimes in plain sight.